Dogman chased my daughter. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I got a Dogman story for you from northern Michigan. I'm guessing you've gotten your share from that part of the world. This one dates back to when my daughter was still a kid, and she's now in pre-med, so the story goes back a ways. If this story had played out just a little bit differently, she might not have lived long enough to become a med student, and that's because Dogman chased my daughter. Let's call her Jamie, which is not her real first name, and let's call my wife Marla, which is a personal family in-joke. The three of us were invited to spend a month house-watching for some friends of my wife's family. My wife and daughter were going to use this opportunity to get some serious vacation time in. I had to work through the month, but I work from my computer and it doesn't matter where I am as long as I have an internet connection. The house in question is located in a nice little town called Cross Village way up in northern Michigan, not far from Canada. My wife and I don't really like too much heat, so we were only too happy to drive north for the summer. Jamie wasn't a picky person yet. She didn't even know how to be offended by anything until they taught her that in college. The house is located not too far from the beach, and we all adapted to life there within a few days. Jamie had abandoned the local roads to get to and from the beach, preferring to cut through the woods back and forth and blaze her own trail. She was a real individualist in those days. The town is quaint and has nice shops and so forth, but it's also surrounded by some natural habitats and animal or nature preserves. For instance, the Nequeshtat Wat Nature Preserve, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, is to the west of town. Then comes the Cranmer Nature Preserve, then the house in Cross Village where we were staying, and then just a few blocks to our east is the Shirtleft Nature Preserve. Cross Village seems to be named after the white cross located over near the Shirtleft Preserve, as far as I can tell. It's not all that big of a cross, it doesn't really stick out all that much, but then again, neither does Cross Village itself. If the Dogman really does live in the area, my guess would be that its home base is one of those three animal preserves located so closely together. One day we had a plumbing issue, and after a very nice local plumber came out to rescue us from disaster, we offered him some coffee and cake before he left. Somehow the conversation switched to cryptids, and my daughter asked if Bigfoot ever visited the area. The plumber told us he didn't know about Bigfoot in Michigan, but back in 1967, the Dogman actually came to Cross Village itself. We didn't really know all that much about the Dogman, and we joked around about it, thinking that the name was sort of funny. Our daughter thought he was talking about the cartoon Dogman, drawn by Dave Pilkey, and she fell on the floor in hysterics about the idea of cartoon Dogman walking through town. Well, that plumber did not see anything funny about it. He told us that the Dogman is something we should take care not to come in contact with. He said just stick to the roads and beaches, don't venture into the forests. He also told us that there was a Blair Witch kind of Dogman documentary shot in Cross Village as well. He claimed 6 young filmmakers disappeared less than a mile from the house we were staying in after they went out looking for the Dogman. He was absolutely dead serious about this, and we all stopped laughing. Then our daughter did her imitation of the very serious plumber, and we all broke up. Jamie was really funny and original before she went to college, but somehow either the Dogman or fate decided that she wasn't being very funny after all, because she almost got caught by the Dogman. When she got too comfortable walking through the woods we were warned to stay out of. So as I think I said, Jamie liked to spend her days down at the beach, and sometimes her mother would go with her, but not every day. On this particular day in question, Jamie was alone, and she didn't make it back in time for dinner. When she got to be around a half hour late, I called her cell phone, and it went immediately into messages, so I knew she had it turned off. I began to get worried and I decided to walk down to the beach and see if I could locate her. Remembering how she had bragged that she liked to walk through the woods to and from the beach, I walked into the trees, hoping that the GPS on my phone would help me keep going in the correct direction. I must have been in the woods for about 10 minutes, uncertain if I was going in the right direction, when I heard a scream. If you're a father or mother, the last sound you ever want to hear is your kid screaming, and that is what I heard. I took off running in that direction and I saw her. There was my Jamie, but she was running in the wrong direction. She was never going to get home that way. She was running parallel to the house we were watching, not toward it. I called out to her, but at first she was screaming too loud to hear me. I kept it up until I saw her head turn in my direction and I saw her eyes light up. She ran toward me and I ran toward her, but she was gesturing with her arm and trying to get me to look somewhere. I didn't understand what her gesturing meant. Should I look behind myself? There didn't seem to be anything there, but I was pretty sure that was the way back to our vacation home. Then I saw what she was gesturing toward, and it made me really angry. There was a guy in a Dogman suit scaring my daughter. I figured it was the plumber himself. Jamie ran past me back toward the house, but I marched over toward that creep in the costume. Only when I got closer, I saw that costumed man wasn't a costumed man. He barked at me and came running directly toward me. It was an animal, the strangest looking one I'd ever seen. It had light blue eyes, so light that they were nearly white in color. It bared its teeth and I saw there was blood all over them. My heart started banging in my chest and I wondered whose blood that was. I beat it back in the direction of the house for a while until I heard my daughter calling out to me. Following her voice, I found she was out on either Waterfront Drive or Chippewa Drive, I don't remember which. There were other people out there as well, so I felt safe. I remembered what the plumber had said. Stick to the roads. Stay out of the woods. That's what Jamie and I did as we jogged home, completely paranoid the entire way. That's the last time I go inside those woods, she told me, and I believed her. She was pale as a sheet and looked like she was going to be nauseous. When we got back to the house, Jamie wasn't hungry. She was too upset. Marla wasn't sure at first whether we were joking or not, but when Jamie didn't eat, she knew this was all for real. We had actually gotten chased part of the way home by the Michigan Dogman. So either my wife or I would accompany Jamie to the beach for the next few days, and she would call us before coming home as well. This was actually her idea. She didn't like the feeling of being stalked by the Dogman, and she never wanted it to happen again. After a few days of that, things sort of went back to normal, and she just stuck to the main pathways and out of the woods. We'd text her every couple or 3 hours, and she'd text back a thumbs up emoji or an A-OK to let us know that everything was cool. One day, my wife and I stopped in to apologize to that plumber, telling him that we in fact saw the creature. He was very interested since he had never heard of the creature being in that part of town, the part we saw him in, and he asked us for a complete description. It was dark, I told him, but the snout was a lighter color. It was about my height, standing on its hind legs. The eyes were very pale blue. When I got to that part, he told me that was the traditional eye color of the Michigan Dogman, and that I was lucky to have gotten out of those woods with my life. He told us to look up the Cross Village tapes, which he said were found footage tapes of a Dogman stalking and killing right outside of town. When we got back to the house, we did look it up, but it seems to be a fictional film as far as we can tell. In our last week in the house, just a few days before we packed up for home, we had one more confrontation with the legendary creature. I was asleep in bed when my wife woke me up to tell me to go downstairs and check on Jamie. She had been sleeping on the ground level while my wife and I were up on the second floor. I jogged down to the stairwell and nearly ran face first into Jamie as she came flying up the stairs, panicked. "It's outside my window," she screamed, and I didn't have to ask her what was outside her window. I already understood that part. I really did not want to go down to the first floor, but I felt like I had to see if that thing had gotten inside. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a frying pan to use as a weapon, then made my way to Jamie's room, shaking all over. I prayed that I would not need to use that frying pan, not so much because I'm afraid of violence, as because I didn't think it would be enough of a weapon to protect me against the Dogman, if it was the same one as last time. Peeking around the corner into her room, I thought my heart was going to give out on me. If the Dogman was making noise, I wouldn't have heard it, because my heartbeat was too loud in my ears. I couldn't see anyone or anything outside those windows, so I nervously and cautiously checked each of them to see if they were locked. Once that was done, I pulled the shade so that I could no longer see out, and hopefully nothing could see in either. Back upstairs, Jamie was half hysterical, telling her mother the story over and over again. "It was right there. It might have been there for an hour before I woke up," she shouted. "It might be watching me every night." Jamie was upset because she never would have known it was even there if she hadn't opened her eyes at that particular moment. What if it had been stalking her all month? She was too afraid to go back downstairs, so she took over the upstairs bedroom next to ours for the remaining few days. None of us really slept well again until we got back home, and that last week was not half as much fun as the first few weeks had been. Something about knowing that the Dogman has your home address is even more unsettling than seeing him in the woods. It felt like this had become far too personal. To me, this story gets me upset each time I retell it. I don't think I ever felt so vulnerable and so incapable of defending my family before, and I never felt so defenseless again until the riots in 2020 burned down our neighborhood stores. The way our local government kept releasing the criminals to riot over and over again reminded me of the Dogman, who I do not believe can be killed by human hands or means. It was the most frightening thing I've lived through in my life since the summer when Dogman chased my daughter. I saw a Dogman. But what is a Dogman? Dear Scary Stories NYC, I was with my father and my sister when I had my lone encounter with a cryptid, in our case, a Dogman. Since the three of us have very different worldviews, we also have very different interpretations of our shared experience. I'd like to tell you what we all agree happened to us in terms of our Dogman experience, and then I'd like to get into what different meanings the three of us attached to it. First of all, my father, who I will call Dad, not his real name, is an old hippie atheist. He was raised by a very strict and humorless old-school Christian who he rebelled against, resulting in the odd fellow he now is. Second of all, my sister, who I will call Sister, also not her real name, and I were both raised by our lunatic dad to be atheists like him. We rebelled against this, but we are not like our late grandparents. We both inherited our father's sense of humor, but atheism seems empty to us, and we both have become very spiritual. I'm a Christian, but I don't belong to any specific denomination, having arrived at my own personal version of Christianity. Sister is what I call New Age, but she resents that term. When I asked her to tell me what I should call her in this email I'm sending you, she couldn't get it down to under 50 words. She's spiritual in a sort of Buddhist way, at least in my opinion, but she listens to New Age music, and she has crystals and pyramids all over her apartment. And cats. Lots of cats. So, whatever you call that, that's who she is. Although my family doesn't agree on anything, We're all humble enough and have enough of a sense of humor that we don't disown each other for voting the wrong candidate or any of that nonsense. We all understand that it's the 1% who want you to hate your Trump-supporting uncle or your Biden-supporting aunt. We don't care who you voted for in the last election, and we know you might change your mind before the next election. We don't cancel each other for past mistakes because we see each other as ever-changing beings. So even though we're each so different, we like to hang out and we like to laugh together. We watch comedies, we play Mad Libs, and when the TV tells us not to hug, we hug twice as much. We, none of us, have much in this world, especially since Mom passed on, but we are confident that we at least have each other. This story sort of starts like a joke. A Christian, an atheist, and a New Ager go camping together. But after that, it gets kind of serious. One thing the three of us have in common is a strong distaste for authority and rules. When we were told to avoid each other and stay locked in our own hovels, we banded together and went camping. Although I'm not going to tell you where we're from, I'll tell you exactly where we went to camp. In the woods north of Tarentum, PA. I think those woods are actually part of Tarentum, so I should say the northern part of Tarentum. There's a very scary Halloween attraction in those woods called the Shadows Haunted Attraction, which features a haunted mine as well. We went camping in the summer, not during Halloween time, plus it was during COVID, so it wasn't open anyway. I think they're opening up again for Halloween this year, and I'd like to go back there if possible. If you haven't been to this place, you owe it to yourself to check it out. Now, why would we want to camp near a closed haunted house attraction in the summer? Well, our favorite part of that place is the walk through the haunted woods, which is the scariest thing in the world to me for whatever reason. I know there are fancier and bigger budget scary houses and hayrides and so forth, but the walk through the woods there is my family's personal favorite. We were, all three of us, sick of being scared by television and the news, so we went off into the woods to find a more fun way to be scared. One that we didn't have to take so seriously. Only it ended up getting pretty tense pretty fast, thanks to an unannounced appearance by the Dogman. At dusk the first day, we were lucky and had just beautiful weather. The sky was lit up all orange and red and yellow and blue as the sun set, and it really was quite relaxing. It was like the skies were putting on a show just for us in our illegal campsite that we didn't pay for. As it actually began to be dark, we began to play our evening's entertainment. Our family plays strange games, so check this out. First of all, we put on glow-in-the-dark t-shirts, which we charge up pretty well. This is so we can see whoever is it, even if they can't see us. Then, whoever is it is blindfolded, taken out into the woods, and turned around 13 times for bad luck. This leaves you disoriented and quite dizzy. Then, you have to make your way back to the campsite in the dark. We don't even light our campfire until this game is over. We like it to be challenging. What happens if we walk the wrong way and get lost? Well, that's the function of the glow-in-the-dark t-shirts. When we see whoever is it walking away, or if we lose sight of their glow, we set off our air horn to give them a hint of the right direction. You might think this is not as scary to go through as a haunted house, but I would differ with you. To me, it was 10 times as scary because it's not a show put on by friendly locals. It's a real-life, actual, scary woods. If you say so what to that, then you must not have ever wandered through the Pennsylvania woods when it's really dark out at night. I went first this time, and it was much scarier than usual for me. I felt around for trees, yet walked into some right away. I thought I was feeling around with my feet, yet I tripped over a big tree root anyhow. I had a constant feeling that I was being watched, and off in the distance behind me, I heard a dog howling. Or I heard some kind of canine howling at least. I froze, wondering if that was Dad howling as a joke. If it was him, then I was walking in the wrong direction. When the howling was followed by sounds from my left and my right of return howls from even further away. I decided to keep walking forward. Luckily for me, that was the correct choice, and I was soon back in the clearing where we were camping. Sister was due up next, but I told her and Dad about the howling I had heard, and I suggested we call it quits for the night. My idea was that we should try again the next day, but maybe we should do it during dusk, before it got so very dark as it was that night. Sister rejected my idea, saying I was just trying to hog all the scariness for myself. So she put on her glow-in-the-dark t-shirt, and Dad led her into the woods to turn her around and disorient her. I'm a bit protective of my sister, so I disobeyed both hers and Dad's wishes, and I began building a fire pit to create a campfire. I wanted her to be able to see where she was going. I was still working on it when Dad came back and started to argue with me that I was treating my sister like she was a child. I suggested to him that he better keep an eye on her glowing t-shirt because I was going to collect firewood. So he did. The next thing I remember was hearing an absolutely blood-curdling scream, like something out of a horror movie. I immediately went into denial, not wanting to believe that this was my sister screaming. I knew, however, that it was definitely her voice. Running back to camp, I was relieved to see her racing out of the woods, her eyes as big as saucers. She had found her way back to camp, and I began to breathe a sigh of relief. And that is when I saw it. A hairy man was running after my sister, and at first I thought it was a psycho in a furry costume. Both Dad and I ran toward her, shouting at the man to leave her alone. As I shone my flashlight at him, however, my father and I could see clearly, fully illuminated, that this furry was a real flesh and blood monster creature. It had a dog's head, or a wolf's head, but it was brown and spotted, unlike any kind of dog or wolf I've ever seen. The head was proportionately larger than a canine's head would normally be to the body, and it seemed built to bite and eat anything in front of it, almost like a land shark. The teeth were impossibly large and resembled white pearly daggers. This was not a man, but it was not a dog or a bear either. First of all, it was running on its hind legs as it snapped at my sister, keeping her moving and screaming as it did so. Its long front arms reached out and tried to grab her, as its hind legs motored along at an impressive rate, far faster than a bear can run when upright. So I would like to say that when we saw what was chasing my sister, that we ran even faster to rescue her. But the truth is, Dad and I turned and ran away, screaming just as loud as she was screaming. All of a sudden, we weren't having the fun kind of being scared anymore. Now we were scared in the bad way. All three of us piled into my father's tent, which was the largest. I don't think any of us wanted to be alone in that moment. The dog-headed man barked at us savagely, but let us get in the tent. It could easily have chosen one of us to attack and prevented our entry or pulled us right back out. But instead, it behaved something like a sheepdog. It basically herded us into the tent. Inside, we wondered what it was going to do now that it had us herded into a corner. Was it going to go get others and tear down our tent? Right after one of us whispered that very question, the creature outside howled so loudly that I felt like my eardrums were about to burst. This was a painful howl, louder than our air horn. The air horn. I grabbed it and I blew it. If the dog-headed man could signal to his kind, maybe we could signal to our kind. I'm not sure what kind of cavalry I expected to come to the rescue, but I just knew in my panic that I wanted to be rescued. I blew that air horn over and over until my father wrestled it away from me. He said something, but my ears were ringing and I couldn't tell what he was saying for some time. The three of us were fairly deafened by what had just happened, and we couldn't even tell if the dogman was still outside. There could have been 5 of them out there, but if they didn't come up and mess with our tent, we weren't going to be able to hear them. The 3 of us hugged, silently, and waited for our ears to stop ringing so much. After some time, my father became convinced that the creature had gotten scared away. He said he was going to stick his head outside and check, which Sister and I thought was a terrible idea. He calmed us down and said the creature was not close enough to attack him, that he'd have plenty of time to get back in the tent if he saw it running toward him. Those sounded like famous last words from a horror flick, but Dad grabbed a flashlight and stuck his head out of the tent anyway. I really expected him to come back inside with nothing on top but a bloody neck. I really saw his life flashing in front of my eyes. When he came back in, though, his face was still where it was supposed to be. He said my brilliant idea to scare off the dogman with the air horn had worked. I took credit for saving the day, but in truth, I was blowing the horn hoping some park ranger or someone would hear it and come running. It hadn't even dawned on me that an air horn might scare off an actual cryptid monster. So that proves that Dogman does have weaknesses and limitations. I suppose it might be proof that he's mortal and not an all-powerful deity or anything like that. We were too scared to go to our own tents, and we were too hyped up to sleep, so we sat up in Dad's tent, arguing over what had just happened. I made a comment to the effect that we had just been visited by a devil, that we had just walked through the valley of the shadow of death. I felt this dogman was a Jungian archetypal manifestation of what we had come there to meet, but it was far more real than what we had been hoping for. We had gotten a little more than we had bargained for, but it was like God or nature was responding specifically to our request to be frightened by something in the woods. Dad asked me if I was finished yet, then launched into one of his long speeches about facing facts and not embellishing life. He said I was too much of a poet and not enough of a realist. What we encountered, according to him, was a natural living creature, and probably one that could be easily explained. Maybe it was a mutant, considering there is a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania. I laughed at him that he was claiming to be siding with science, but in reality, he was siding with a plot line from an old 1950s science fiction movie. I asked him if we were going to face giant 40-foot-tall ants and spiders next, or maybe the Pennsylvania version of Godzilla. Sister had been shaking all over and covered in a blanket through most of this argument, but as she began to calm down, she also began to grow annoyed. At length, she asked us if we were finished trying to see who could urinate the furthest, and she asked when we were going to become curious about her side of the story. After all, she said petulantly, I am the only one of us who touched that thing. Well, that shut us up. What does she mean by that? After some begging and pleading, Sister told us what I suppose we should have asked her about to start with, how she and the dogman first came into contact with each other. I was walking along, Sister began, feeling my way from tree to tree in the darkness. I remembered that we had walked fairly straight along a path to get where I was spun around, so I knew that if I could find the path and keep to it, that I would be okay. Almost immediately, though, I found myself walking through dense vegetation, and I knew I was off track. I decided to walk backwards until I was back at where I started from, but that got me even more lost. As I decided to move in a third direction, I reached out and I felt something fuzzy. I withdrew my hand in disgust, thinking that I had touched a rotten tree or some kind of moldy fungus or something, but at once I heard a deep and low sound emanating from the direction of what I had just touched. I can tell you now I was hearing growling, but in the moment and in the dark, I lacked the surrounding context to understand that. For some reason, I thought I was hearing a tree about to tip over on me. I thought that deep, low sound was the wood about to break because I was still imagining a rotten tree in front of me for whatever reason. I reached forward again, hoping to brace the tree and keep from getting crushed by it. I was ready to feel that weird hairy feeling again, but this time when I touched it, I could feel it breathing. "You touched the dogman's chest?" my father asked. "Yes," Sister continued. "I touched him in the chest area firmly, and at once I saw into him, into his soul, into his experience, into his entire bloodline." "Oh, brother," groaned Dad, "here we go with the psychic new agey crap again." Ignoring our father, Sister went on to describe seeing herself through the eyes of the beast, then seeing quick flashes of his life. She saw him hunting. She saw his mate. She saw his offspring. She saw his youth with his own mother. And then, moving faster and faster, she zoomed back through history and then prehistory and saw the forefathers and foremothers of this creature who lived in a kind of a civilization. Not one like ours, but not savage as this particular dogman was. She saw that he was from an intelligent species that had fallen and destroyed themselves through overhunting and short-sightedness. "Oh boy," Dad moaned, "here comes the lecture on ecology again." "No lecture," said Sister. "There wasn't time." As I was learning his species past, I was suddenly pulled back into the present moment as I sensed that this creature was hungry and that he thought my meat smelled very edible. "Your what smelled who?" asked Dad, who wasn't liking the way this was going. I asked him to please be quiet so she could continue. "Well, that's the entire story, really," she said. "That was when I screamed. That was when I ran. It was pure luck that I ran in the right direction. I could have just as easily run away from here or run into a tree and been eaten by that hairy man." Then Dad and Sister got into an argument over what a man is or is not, and my mind wandered. Did my sister really learn all those things psychically from one touch? Or was that all her imagination making up a story to explain what she was experiencing? It sounded an awful lot like a cautionary tale to me, which makes me skeptical. Not as skeptical as Dad, of course, but still it makes me wonder, and it makes me doubt. But at least she has an idea of what that thing was or is. I don't think it's just an undiscovered species like Dad thinks. I'm not sure if my sister is right, but I do think it's something more than just an animal. Maybe it's a fallen angel. Maybe it's descended from a fallen species. Maybe it's a demonic being that escaped from hell. I don't know, but I don't think it was just an animal like any other that you find in the forest. The only thing I know with absolute certainty is that I saw a dogman. But what is a dogman? It never gets cold, it never gets old, saying thank you to sweet Nicole. I hope wherever we all roam is in the direction of Nicole Gomez. Please join me in thanking Nicole Gomez, who made this episode possible. In return, we share with Nicole our secret, uncensored Sunday night stories that you can hear too if you become a PayPal subscriber at peterbernard.com, or if you click the join link under this or any of our videos and become a channel member. The boy who cried Dogman. When I was young, I was a mischievous kid. I used to pull any number of practical jokes, but my favorite one was this. Every month on the full moon, I would dress up as a werewolf and I would jump out and scare all my friends and my adopted family. Nobody thought it was funny except me. My stepfather and stepmother had no patience for my behavior, and they would punish me in increasingly harsh ways. It finally reached a point where they would lock me up in the attic each month before the full moon arrived and not let me out until afterward. Then, when I was 13 years old, I saw a dark figure peering in the window to the attic. The large, dark silhouette climbed into the room with me and spoke. "I'm here now, son. I've come to take you home." The figure moved into the light, and I could see that it was my true father, and that I could finally leave the world of humans and go live among my own kind at last. The Dogman with rabies. Or the Washington werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Many years ago, when I was young, my father moved my family around a lot. He was the only one of us who worked, so he got to make all the important and expensive decisions. At one point, we were living in a little place called Washington in western New Jersey, not far from Pennsylvania. Our house was in the northeastern part of town, over by the forest. We didn't stay there all that long, but our stay was certainly memorable. This was largely, or maybe I should say entirely, because of the upright walking, 6.5-foot tall, rabid canine that decided to visit our block and say hi. The story started when this woman we'll call Gladys, who lived 2 or 3 houses over from us, ran screaming to our front door while we were eating dinner one night. She started ringing the front doorbell like it was a pinball machine, and my mother started to look worried. Not worried for Gladys. She was worried about how angry my father was starting to seem. He hated, and I mean hated, when people rang a doorbell more than once. I got chosen to go open the door and ask her how we could help her. Well, as soon as I opened that door, she pushed past me and ran inside, screaming incoherently. I looked out there, and then I slammed that door hard, once I saw what she was running from. This thing looked a lot like a Doberman Pinscher, except the markings were dark brown spots over a tan base. Imagine a Doberman marked like a hyena, but way more muscular and running on its hind legs. If you can imagine that, you'd be in the neighborhood of what I was looking at. It looked like something from a jungle or a desert, like maybe somewhere in Africa. Like I said, it was running toward our front door on its hind legs, which I at the time interpreted as it going insane due to it having rabies. I had sussed that it was rabid by the foam all around its mouth and snout. Either that upright walking canine was interrupted in the middle of shaving, or it had rabies and was losing its mind. I double-locked the door and went around checking to see if our windows were closed when my father asked me what the hell I was doing. "Rabid dog," was my reply, which Gladys jumped up and down to agree with. She started pointing at me hysterically, continuing to utter sounds that never finished forming into words. My father jumped up and joined me in securing the house. Then I went back to the front to see where that creature had gone. I couldn't see it anywhere, and neither could Dad, so he got Gladys some liquor to calm her down, and he set about quizzing both of us on what exactly we had seen. Well, we both agreed completely about what we had seen, leaving my parents both wide-eyed in disbelief. If we hadn't both been finishing each other's sentences, I don't think they'd have believed either of us separately. But the way we were both so emphatically insisting that we saw the exact same impossible, rabid man-dog, they were kind of pulled kicking and screaming into the reality in which monsters are real. It was a dogman, or that would be the modern version of what we would call it. The thing had insane-looking eyes, unlike any dog eyes I had ever witnessed, or have witnessed since then. It looked perfectly normal running in that upright posture. It did not look like an animal doing a stupid pet trick. When people ask me about it, I tell them that it was like being confronted by a zombie from one of those more recent zombie films, the ones with the fast-running dead people. The look on its crazy face was one of unreasoning zeal, like it was intensely passionate about not making any sense, if you know what I mean. It was intent on destruction, on chaos, and on death, and it couldn't be reasoned with or slowed down. To say that this was a frightening thing to see would be to trivialize it. There could have been nothing scarier to see in all of creation. There might have been some things just as scary as that, which you might open your door to look out at, but it would be impossible to be more frightening than that diseased monster running with anger, fury, and yet also glee, foam flying from its mouth in all directions. We're all put on this earth to do good, to leave behind more than was here when we started. Well, not that thing. Its days of happiness were over. Its chances at productivity were now gone. It may have once been a father to some other upright walking canine, but now it was just walking illness, ambulatory danger. Maybe it's the rabies that's making it walk on its hind legs, I suggested. Gladys and I had our first disagreement on that point, though. It's a werewolf, she shrieked. It's a demonic presence of evil. Plus, it's got rabies. My father took all this very seriously, and he got on the phone to talk to the operator. He asked her who he should report a rabid dog to, and soon thereafter, he was speaking to someone about it. They said they would send out a crew to search in the morning, which didn't seem soon enough for my father. He tried to argue with them to get someone to come out that night, but was eventually convinced that it would be better to mount a search in the daytime. Not that he had a choice in the matter, really. That night, I got up around 1 a.m. to use the bathroom, and when I got back to my room, I saw that crazy rabid dogman again out the window. It was running in circles around our backyard, tearing up the grass in the process. I watched him run clockwise, and then I watched him run counterclockwise, its rabid tongue hanging way out of its foaming mouth, flapping in the breeze in a sickening manner. Its eyes appeared crossed and ludicrous, its mouth twisted into a nauseating, joyless grin. The nasty, poisonous monster was chasing something I couldn't see. Did it actually see something with its damaged brain? Or was it running in circles merely as a frantic expression of its growing insanity? Was there something I should be doing, I wondered? I couldn't call animal control. They had already said they would arrive in the morning. Should I be waking someone else up? I thought about waking up my father, but he would probably go down there and confront that thing. He could get bitten, and that was the last thing I wanted to happen. My father could be foolhardy when he was angry, at least in my opinion. I had seen him tell off this really big drunk guy at a ball game one time, and if a bunch of others hadn't gotten in between the two of them, Dad would have gotten his head smashed in. He wouldn't want to back down when he saw that dogman ruining his backyard either, and this time there would be no random baseball fans to protect him. And so that was why, instead of telling anybody, I just went back to bed as though I hadn't seen anything at all. In the morning, down in the kitchen, my father was furiously angry, and my mother had clearly been crying. "Did you see what that thing did to our backyard?" asked Mom in an almost accusing manner, as though it were somehow my fault. Then the waterworks opened, and she cried as she put my breakfast on the table. I looked out back, and our yard was a complete mess. The paths where I had seen the dog running were now all dug up and dug out, like deep grooves. Of course, I couldn't admit that I had seen this happening because that would give Mom an actual reason to blame me for it. As it was, she decided I was in trouble. Anyway, "You're going to have to help me and your father fix that yard, young man," she warned me. "You're going to have to help every day until it looks the way," she choked up a bit, "until it looks the way it used to look." She walked away sniffling and victimized as I wondered why she was angry at me over this. I think this day was Friday, but my dad called in sick, and he got some of the other guys on the block to take the day off as well. Then, joined with the animal control people, they formed a mighty dad squad and ventured forth into the woods outside of town. By nightfall, after finding nothing, It was agreed that the dad squad would reconvene on Saturday morning. Another hard day of searching yielded absolutely nothing except tired, aching feet and surly dispositions. On Sunday, the dad squad had whittled down to 4 or 5 guys, one of whom brought beer along with them. This search proved equally as fruitless. The next morning was Monday, and all the dads had to return to work. Nothing had been found, and the block was still tense, wondering where the rabid beast had gone. Well, we never found out, because the creature was never sighted again. We all supposed it either moved on, or else succumbed to its illness, because that was the last any of us ever saw of. The Dogman with rabies, or the Washington werewolf. Don't go anywhere, we've got another scary Dogman story in a second. But first, Tahiri won. One and done. Because of you, we all have fun. Nobody knows quite what your game is. We don't even know what your name is. Please join us in thanking the mysterious Tahiri 1 for making this episode possible. In return, he or she gets to see our secret uncensored Sunday stories, far too wild to run on this channel. If you'd like to become a Scary Stories executive producer like the enigmatic Tahiri 1, just join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or else click the join link under this or any of our videos to become a channel member. PQ Ribber will be along at the end of this episode to fill you in on the deets, but right now, let's jump to our second Dogman story of the day. This one was submitted by Doris1089, and we call this one The Dogman I Knew Would Be There. Dear Scary Stories NYC, have you ever had a feeling of deja vu? I've seen a Dogman 3 times in my life. That's 3 times more than most people. Each time, I sensed in advance that I was about to see the creature, and each time, during the entire experience, I felt that somehow I had lived through all this already. It's been years since my last sighting, but I've been thinking about the Dogman again lately, and I have that feeling building up that I will soon see the hideous and terrifying thing again. The first time this happened, I was just a kid. I didn't even know the term deja vu at that point, I don't think. I was staying overnight with my grandmother at her house in the woods because my mom was in the hospital having my younger brother. I liked Grandma well enough when she came to visit us, but I always felt creeped out in her home. It was dark even when she turned all the lights on. It felt like the walls were alive and drank that light up. I always thought I was seeing things move out of the corner of my eyes in that house, but when I would turn my head, everything would be still. Her entire house was surrounded by crooked trees. They all looked like something out of a horror movie. It felt like they were going to reach out and grab me and swallow me whole, so I was just as afraid to be in her backyard as I was to be in her house. That afternoon, she threw me outside in the back and told me to get some fresh air and to let the wind blow the stink off of me. My mother told me she used to say that to her, too. It was just one of her catchphrases that she'd say to kids, even on days when they didn't smell bad. She was just old school, and her generation felt kids should play outside. So I remember standing just outside her back door, terrified to take even one more step into her backyard, because it was surrounded by the creepiest trees that had ever existed on the planet Earth. They all looked like they could reach right across the yard and grab me. And then I started hearing something just beyond the tree line. Something walking. Something big. I closed my eyes, and in my mind's eye, I saw a terrible-looking monster with a dog-like head. It was gyrating all over like it had palsy, and its head swiveled up and down and back and forth in a crazy fashion. Its eyes looked completely mindless. I was afraid to open my eyes, and I heard myself say something like, Not again. Even at that time, I didn't understand why I had said that, since I'd never seen a monster like that in my life. And yet, I knew that I actually had, and that it led to a horrible experience. Building up all my courage through sheer force of will, I opened my eyes and stared right where I knew the creature would be. And there it was. Somehow I had known exactly what was there, and it was this decrepit, hideous, shaking, dog-headed monster man, walking along in an unsteady fashion on two mangy legs. The creature wore no clothing, and large patches of fur were missing, revealing open sores and wounds that terrified me even further. I wanted to go inside, but I didn't want to get spanked by my grandma. Like I said, she was old school. So I just stood there, watching the dog-like man out of the corner of my eye, hoping it wouldn't notice me. And then my grandmother was shaking me and asking me if I was all right. It was dark out suddenly, and she was telling me that it was time for dinner. I looked to where the monster dog had been, but nothing was there. I don't know how it went from sunset to dark in 1 second, but I didn't care either, because I was relieved to be getting out of that haunted backyard. The next time this sort of thing happened was over 10 years later, when I was in my early 20s. I had made a date with a guy that my mother and father disliked, so I couldn't let him come pick me up at my home. I lied to my parents and said I was going to see a girlfriend, and then I walked down toward the forest where I had arranged for the boy to come get me in his convertible. I was standing under a streetlight, putting more makeup on than I could when my parents were looking, and that horrible feeling of déjà vu came over me again. I knew instantly that the palsied dogman was back, and a second or two later, I heard him approaching in the woods. I put away my makeup, and I felt complete panic. Looking up and down the road, I prayed that boy would show up and rescue me. Just as I knew the dogman was coming, I also knew the boyfriend was not. I thought about running home, but then I saw the thing. As hideous as it was, I had to stare at it. Not only did I remember it from my childhood, I remembered it coming along to bother me right at that very spot that I was standing on. I knew then, and I know now, that's not possible. But I still remembered it coming, and I remembered it making a clicking kind of noise once it saw me. And then, just as I had known would happen, just as I remembered happening, it turned quickly and stared at me, its white eyes looking dead in its skull. Its nasty, quivering mouth opened up, and this insect-like clicking noise came out of it, just the way I had remembered from when. I wanted to run, but I knew that I never ran before when this would happen, and I knew that it would turn out badly for me if I tried to run that time. The next thing I knew, the guy was there in his car, idling in front of me. He was giving a lame apology for being late, and when I was too confused to answer, he became abusive and told me I was being a bitch about it. The dog-headed mange creature was no longer there, and over an hour had passed since I had been looking at it. I looked at the boy, and somehow I saw our entire relationship play out. We were only going to date for another 18 or 20 days. I understood it in that moment. I got in the car, and we drove off, but we were broken up in less than 2 weeks, just as I knew we would be. The third time I remember having an experience like this was 30 years or so later, when I was attending my husband's funeral. He was a police officer, but he didn't leave us due to violence. In fact, he had been moved behind a desk years earlier. My dear Louis had an attack and passed away at his desk very suddenly, at least according to the version that the guys at work gave to me. We didn't even know he had any health issues, and it was very surprising to me and our 2 kids. The day of his funeral, we were at his grave, with the coffin ready to be lowered into the hole that had been dug for it. As the pastor gave his sermon, I got that feeling again, and I knew that it wasn't just us human beings at this funeral. I knew where it would be, and I turned my eyes to see that hideous, shaking monstrosity all the way at the other end of the cemetery. It was standing behind a stone mausoleum, peeking out at me. I had the strangest feeling that I had lived through this exact experience before, even though that made absolutely no sense at all. I looked at the monster in the full light of day for the first time. Some people walked right past it as though it weren't even there. My son and my daughter shook me, and I saw that the coffin was already lowered into the ground. I hadn't seen it being lowered. I felt like I'd been skipped forward in time. The palsied, mangy dogman was no longer where it had once been, and I had to come back to the world of the living and take care of my kids. That was years ago. My daughter is in labor as I write this. She lives on the other side of the country now with her husband, but I've made arrangements to go visit the two of them once the baby is born. I'm afraid to leave the house and get in my car, though, because I have that feeling again. I know the dogman is going to be out there. I know what direction it's going to come from, too. And I know that, somehow, this exact thing has happened to me before. It's time for me once more to encounter the dogman I knew would be there. I felt sorry for myself because I had no doorman. But then I met a man who had no scary stories, psychic Bigfoot versus savage Bigfoot paraphernalia. Did you know you could be wearing a psychic Bigfoot versus savage Bigfoot t-shirt right now? They come in white, black colors, long sleeve, short sleeve, little baby red sleeve, wife beater size, pregnant wife size. Plus, you can own a scary stories, psychic Bigfoot versus savage Bigfoot hat, hoodie, journal, postcards, wall decals. All this can be yours right now by going to cafepress.com/scarystories NYC. Link is in the description. The Cemetery Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, there's a very strange and unique cemetery located in a town I won't name in upstate New York. I'll show you pictures and even video of the place, and you will recognize it if you've ever been there. Because it's located essentially in the backyards of a few private homes, however, I don't want to give out its address, as I don't want the people who live there to be visited by random strangers because of my story. After all, if someone saw a werewolf or dogman walking out of your backyard, would you want everyone to know? Yes. Both my girlfriend and I saw a hairy humanoid with a dog-like head emerging from that cemetery. And yes, I'm going to tell you everything I can remember about it. First, you need to understand the crazy reason that we were at that cemetery in the first place. There is a legend in my family about a great-great-great-grandfather of my cousin, who I will call Uncle Ollie for the sake of this narrative. Uncle Ollie was alleged to be a werewolf. He was the son of a German immigrant who lived during and after the Civil War in America back in the 1800s. Uncle Ollie was supposed to have turned to a wolf-like, yet still humanoid creature from time to time. I was never told how he came to be a werewolf in the first place, and as a kid, I always assumed he was just born that way. It might be that nobody knew how he became afflicted in this way, and that's why that seemingly important detail was left out of all the stories I heard about him. And I heard stories about him anytime any of my older relatives were over for a visit, or when we would visit them after church on Sundays. My siblings and I were given a fairly strict Lutheran upbringing, and the church was the center of our social lives. We'd often meet with family members at our church and go off from there. Sometimes we'd even be regaled with Uncle Ollie stories right there in the church backyard, or on the way driving home from church. In our family, our werewolf ancestor was as popular a figure as Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. even though none of us ever saw him or met him. We'd speak of him as though he were real, and as though he might come back and punish us kids if we did not behave, our parents and our pastor. We have a number of crazy legends about our werewolf ancestor, and neither I nor my siblings ever thought there was anything weird about them while we were growing up. It really wasn't until I went away to college and told my dorm mate about Uncle Ollie that I found out that not every family had their own werewolf legend. When I later moved in with my girlfriend we can call Margaret, she was very into tracing family histories. She asked me if I had anyone interesting in my family's past, and I just started laughing. After she heard some of the stories about Ollie, she went to work trying to see if any of them might be proven true. First, she verified that there in fact had been a man by that name, his real name I mean, not Ollie. Born in Brooklyn, New York, he served in the Union Army during the Civil War, but she never found anything about him being a werewolf. She shouldn't have, though, as the family story is that he was guarded and protected by his relatives and was never caught out or turned over to authorities. He was supposed to have lived to a normal age and died of natural causes, so the fact that she found no stories about him being a werewolf actually meshes perfectly with the family legend. I was very happy to share this info with my parents and siblings, and I expected that to be the end of it. Eventually, Margaret surprised all of us as she was able to suss out that Ollie was buried in a certain Lutheran cemetery up north of us. Excitedly, we began planning out our legend trip to that location. Here is the gate to the place, located between two normal-looking homes on a normal-looking suburban street. It's really like something out of a spooky old movie that this would exist where it does. We both stood there for a while, marveling at the ancient-looking gate in front of a long, thin strip of grass, instead of it being in front of a graveyard. Margaret noticed tombstones way in the back, and she said, "Let's go in." I expected the gate would be locked, and I wondered who we should ask for permission to enter, but Margaret had already pushed the gate aside and began jogging down the long, thin lawn. Apparently, it was open to the public. We wondered aloud if this used to be located in the middle of the woods a long time ago, or possibly could one of these houses have at one time been the location of a church. The homes looked like they were built in the 20th century, and certainly none of them looked like a former church. The entire situation was just so very unique. From my now broken digital camera, which was old even when I shot this footage, our breath was immediately taken away from the age of the tombstones. Some of them were too old to even read any longer. The most recent ones seemed to be from the 1950s. There were no more after that. Most were of people that passed on in the 1800s as my ancestor did. I'm not going to tell you which of these is his tombstone to protect our anonymity, but we did find it, and it is shown at some point in this video. I'm just not going to tell you when. I suppose this is a good point to fill you in with the stories I was told since I was a child about this ancestor of mine. The stories usually ended with a cautionary warning not to be like Uncle Ollie, or else we'd end up a werewolf like he became. There was one exception to that rule, which was the Civil War story, in which Uncle Ollie allegedly turned into the wolfman that he became, then took out an entire battalion of Confederate soldiers, freeing 100 slaves in the process, so that they could begin the long trek northward to freedom. That story is probably too good to be true, but it's always been my favorite anyway. Ollie is basically a superhero in that one. Plus, it didn't have an annoying moral at the end. Uncle Ollie's lycanthropy was not moon-based. That is to say, he would transform most often at moments which were inconvenient for him and his family. Supposedly he was scheduled to be the best man at his brother Jethro's wedding, but Uncle Ollie drank too much the night before out of nervousness, then spent the entire wedding day prowling the outskirts of town as an animal. that story came with an advisory to avoid excess drinking. Another time, Uncle Ali got into a feud with a neighbor that he refused to resolve. Both men became hardened enemies and would go out of their way to bother each other. When Uncle Ali came home one day to discover that the neighbor had been allowing his sheep to graze on Ali's property without permission, Ali allegedly became the beast man and ate one of the sheep for dinner that night. It led to a lawsuit between the families that stretched on into the next generation after Ali was gone. The moral of that story was to maintain the peace with one's neighbors at all costs. Better to compromise than to create multi-generational conflict. In our family, the weeks leading up to a birthday were the worst weeks of the year. Both our parents would tell us the story of Uncle Ali's sad birthday over and over to the point where we could finish their sentences for them. Uncle Ali went wild as the werewolf one year and destroyed some of the family's property. He got no presents at all as a consequence, and no birthday party either that year. We were not only told that story, but each year we were asked, "Have you been good this year? Have you earned a birthday party? Have you earned a birthday present?" The fact that Uncle Ali had his birthday party taken away for something the werewolf did always seemed so unfair to me. But the lesson was, we must always control our inner demons. If you let your wild nature come out, that means losing all your human privilege. It was a way to terrorize us kids, hitting us where we were most vulnerable, in our desire for presence and attention and love. There was no such thing as unconditional love in our family, only guilt and worry that we hadn't earned our home and that we might be discarded like Hansel and Gretel and left to fend for ourselves. We had a Thanksgiving werewolf story in our family too. Uncle Ali grew stressed out at having to try to be polite to all the relatives who had gathered for Thanksgiving one year, and he supposedly turned into the werewolf version of himself. The werewolf didn't have to be polite at all, and he rudely ate everyone's dinner, leaving very little Thanksgiving for anyone else. That story would get told by someone each November, and I remember a number of different morals being attached to it. Don't be a glutton. Eat your share and not one bite more was the moral one year. Another time, the moral came from the fact that even after acting out in such a terrible manner, still, nobody in the family outed Uncle Ali to the authorities. Blood is thicker than mud, we were told. Loyalty to the family is to be more highly valued than public laws or morals. In another version of the story, Ali was never allowed to dine with the extended family ever again, being forced into a cage each Thanksgiving for the safety of the others, and only allowed to eat their scraps like a dog. Act like a dirty dog, be treated like a dirty dog, we were warned. Family loyalty in that version of the story only went so far. Supposedly, Uncle Ali kept getting dumped by his lady friends. It seemed he would get nervous and excited on dates, and when Uncle Ali got nervous and excited, he would become the werewolf. One time, he's supposed to have chased one of his girlfriends up a tree, leading to her family refusing to allow her to continue seeing our hero. The moral of that one was, never behave like an animal while on a date. Ali did eventually marry, and supposedly he had 2 daughters. I'm not sure how the daughters figured into our family history, as I believe they both married into other families. If they inherited Ali's werewolf affliction, it was never mentioned in the stories we were told as kids. Uncle Ali and his wife eventually are supposed to have either left the family or been kicked out of the family, and they moved up north. I always imagined that meant he moved to Canada, but the cemetery that Margaret tracked him down to was and is technically up north of New York City. I suppose it fits well into the legends, even if it ruins my vision of the werewolf roaming free through the tundra of the northern Canadian wilderness. So, on the day we visited this remarkable old cemetery, We didn't find the place until the middle of the afternoon. Amazingly, the cemetery overlooks a huge parking lot in front of a Price Chopper store, a Dunkin' Donuts, and some other modern convenience outlets. It's just so bizarre standing next to a tombstone from 1840 and looking down at these garish stores right next to it. Plus, the cemetery is way up in the air from the parking lot, and it feels like one bad rainstorm and all the graves would slide down the hill and wind up in the handicap parking spots. I found everything about that location hard to believe, which is why I felt compelled to videotape all of it. Staring out at Price Chopper had a different effect on my girlfriend, however. She wanted to see if they had better prices in there than in our neighborhood. She wanted to go shopping. So, of course, that's what we did. We got our car and pulled on into that giant parking lot. Then she loaded our trunk and back seat up with all sorts of things that wouldn't melt or spoil before we got home. She bought so much stuff that we ended up having to give some of it away because we didn't have enough room to store it all in our apartment. But, it made her happy, so it was fine. After shopping, we both stopped in Dunkin' Donuts for some coffee. That was a mistake. By the time we left the Dunkin', it was already getting dark out, but now we were both charged up with caffeine and raring to do something else besides just driving home. I wanted to go back to the cemetery and see what it looked like at night. Margaret said that would be rude, and they probably lock it up at night anyway. I countered that I bet it looked really spooky at night, and she responded that we'd be bothering the people who live there and disrespecting the families of those who were buried there. I asked her what the harm would be just to walk past it one more time before going home, and she allowed that it would be alright to walk past it and look at the front gate with the gloomy nighttime sky up behind it. Well, it was a moot point because we never quite made it all the way back. Oh, we walked out of the parking lot and up the block toward the cemetery all right. We were getting close to it when suddenly we heard heavy footsteps coming from our right. I did not have my camera out, or I would show you the footage of this as it happened. It seemed at first to be a big man running like a lunatic from the graveyard up the narrow grass alleyway, running so fast as to be intimidating and frightening to both me and Margaret. We stopped walking and sort of moved over to the right, not wanting whoever that was to notice us as he ran by. I think I thought it was somebody who robbed someone and was running away. As he approached the front of the property, we could see that we had good reason to feel a sense of caution, as that was not a man at all. It was a hairy creature with a dog-like head, running upright as though it were a man on its hind legs. Neither of us knew what we were looking at, but it was what you would probably call a dogman these days. It had dark brown fur and a dog head with canine back legs. Its arms and torso, however, seemed very humanoid, although a humanoid covered in brown fur. Whatever that was crashed through the front gate, not slowing down for a second as it accelerated across the street and into a patch of woods on the other side of the road and eventually out of our view. The entire episode lasted possibly 15 seconds, from the moment we heard the stomping, running footsteps to when it ran into the woods and disappeared. Margaret and I looked at each other, turned around, and hightailed it back to our car in the parking lot. I looked over my shoulder the entire time and tripped twice or 3 times. Once we were in the car, I felt too scared to drive for a while, nervous about running into that suburban monster all over again. Eventually, Margaret pointed out that it was only going to get darker, and we'd feel safer once we were on the highway. That was all true, and so I turned the key and started the long drive back to New York City. Neither of us thought about what we saw as a werewolf until long after we got home. It was not wearing clothing, for one thing. In all my life, when I would imagine what Uncle Ollie looked like, I imagined him wearing torn-up clothes from the 1800s as he had his werewolf adventures. I think I saw him sort of like that Oliver Reed werewolf from the old Hammer Wolfman picture he starred in. I just looked it up, and that movie is called The Curse of the Werewolf and is set in France in the 1700s, so 100 years before my ancestor was supposed to have roamed New York City and the regions to the north of it. Our friends insisted that we saw a dogman or a werewolf. They taught us about the Michigan Dogman and the Beast of Bray Road in Wisconsin. I was especially taken aback by the Bray Road stories, as I had just learned that the Oliver Reed Wolfman movie I just mentioned was filmed at a place called Bray Studios. That seemed like a very large synchronicity to me and Margaret in that moment. Our friends joked that it was Uncle Ollie we saw rising from the grave, or that it was a local descendant of his visiting his gravesite. The coincidence of Bray Road and Bray Studios, though, made me wonder if the Dogman might have really had nothing at all to do with Uncle Ollie. What if that was not a werewolf at all, nor a relative of mine, but instead a natural animal or cryptid that lives in that lovely area upstate, running from one woods to another? Here is a satellite map of the area from Google Maps with some of the place names fudged out in Photoshop so as not to give the location away too much. There is a lot of forest land and even a natural wild protected area in the direction he was running from south of the graveyard. And there are trees and a small forest exactly where he was running to when we lost sight of him. It could either be a real creature traveling land he was used to traversing, or it could have been a natural animal who wandered too far north and got lost. Maybe it ran into those trees thinking it was heading home to the protected wildlife area to the south. Maybe that's why it was running. Maybe it was terrified of the human houses and civilization and only trying to get out of this strange place and back home to what it was familiar with. Then again, maybe it was a werewolf after all. Maybe it had everything to do with my being there, or maybe it had everything to do with Uncle Ollie. Maybe lycanthropy can be passed down, and maybe I witnessed a cousin of mine running by on that strange night. All I know is I never want to go back there. I've had all I can fit in my brain about that particular ancestor of mine. I've taken to heart that Thanksgiving moral from so many years earlier. Don't be a glutton. Eat your share, and not one bite more. And I'm 100% certain that I've had my fill of the cemetery dogman. Christina, 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 Christina. She's as glorious as Athena, more graceful than a dozen impalas. That's R.E.P. Christina Gonzalez. Christina Gonzalez is so cool, she saw this episode yesterday. That's because she's one of our top tier $10 channel members. She not only gets to see our shows in advance, she has access to all our secret uncensored Dogman stories, far too wild to tell on this channel. Plus, our entire archive of almost 20 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories too.
I'd like to take a moment to say that if you have a scary story you'd like to tell us here, you can write Peter at peterbernard.com, or you can call our new Scary Stories hotline number and leave it to us in the form of a voicemail message. It's easy to remember. 804-LESCARY. That's 804-LESCARY, or 804-537-2279.
Dogman. Blocking the highway. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a strange story for you today. It's a Dogman story, but it's also one of those stories that Jim Harold calls a head scratcher. I was there when it happened, but I can't for the life of me explain any of it. Let me just tell you what happened. I was driving north on Pennsylvania Route 35, and I was down by Pine Ridge. The hill of the ridge was to my right, and on my left There was a row of trees, then cleared land of some sort, and then the mountains beyond. It was after midnight, and I was driving home from a long and unsuccessful business trip, so I was not in the mood for any nonsense. As you already know, that's when life will choose to throw nonsense in your face. Off in the distance, I thought I saw a man standing in the road right over the yellow line, trying to either block the road or hail down a driver for help or something like that. I got a bit nervous, as it might be the survivor of an accident, or it might be a trap to get me to stop so his friends could surround my car and literally commit highway robbery. I noticed there was not much space past the edge of the road on my side. If I were going to attempt a fast and furious maneuver to get past this guy, it would have to be done by going into the left lane or past it. Since there was no traffic except for me on the road at that hour, I didn't really have to worry about driving into another car if I went on the wrong side of the road. As I drew closer to the guy and my headlights lit him up better, all bets were off. That was either a very big man wearing a monster costume from a movie, or I was seeing an actual creature as muscular as a Sasquatch, but in most other ways looking very dog-like. It was sort of like a wolf with hands standing upright, and yet also it was an almost humanoid hairy monster, but with a dog head. It could not have been an ape head, as the ears were up on top, not on the sides. And it was not a bear head, because the ears were closer to being tall triangles than they were to being rounded like a bear's ears. Did I mention he was tall? Well, he was tall. He had his legs splayed out, and he was wide enough to be effectively blocking both lanes of traffic at the same time. If I tried to speed up and drive past him, I would have hit some part of him in the process. A part of me deep down inside told me, well, that's his problem. If he's gonna play stupid games, he's gonna win stupid prizes. But then I remembered that news story from a little while back about the guy dressed up as Bigfoot that got hit by the unlicensed teenage driver that time. I suddenly could relate, and I understood why that girl sped up when she saw him in the road. I had the exact same urge. But what if this was also just a dumb guy trying to make a viral video or something? If I deliberately ran into a monster that turned out to be a human, man, I would be guilty of an unforgivable crime. And so it was the so-called civilized part of me overruled my fight-or-flight instinct and caused me to slow my car down. As I rolled to a stop, the dog-headed whatever it was took one running step forward, then leaped onto my hood. I screamed in complete surprise, not having expected this thing to do that. I had its dog head pushed up against my windshield right in front of me, baring its teeth and sure looking real. It was not a costume. It was an actual living animal. When it breathed out, my windshield would fog up in that area for a few seconds. The pupils dilated as it stared at me, and I don't think they make contact lenses that do that. So those were real eyes. Real canine eyes. While I sat there, slack-jawed, wide-eyed, comprehending what was in front of me, I didn't notice the creature's arm reaching through my driver's side window until it grabbed me by the throat. I was a goner. I knew I was a goner as soon as that hand-like paw closed around my throat and lifted my butt up off that seat. He didn't even have good leverage, yet he was able to do that with sheer brute force strength. He had more power in that one hand than I have in my entire body. So, how can I still be alive? Well, by accident, basically. The animal man swung me back and forth like it was playing with a rag doll, and already I was seeing spots in front of my eyes. But one of his wild shakes apparently caused my hands to bang hard into my car horn. The beast was surprised by the loud noise and briefly let go of my throat. Again, through luck more than anything else, when he dropped me, my foot came down on the gas pedal and I drove forward. The dog-headed man slammed hard into my windshield, and then the first act of mine that was consciously thought of by me happened. And what that was that I slammed on the brakes. The hairy manimal rolled back off my hood, and I leaned back down on the gas, swerving and screeching around the dogman's fallen body and resuming my travels away from him, further up northward on Route 35. I had thought I was dead for sure, but I had survived. I looked in the rear view mirror, and that creature was still just struggling to right itself. It looked in no mood to pursue me. I was safe. I had encountered my first cryptid of my life, and I had come out the victor in our conflict. Score 1 for the human race. I was still breathing hard, and my heart was beating wildly when I got a ways down the road up to around Lac Township. At least I think that's where I was, over by where the state game lands is ahead to the right. I had not calmed down yet, and in fact, I was still checking my rearview mirror to see if that thing was going to run up after me. Suddenly, I wondered if I was losing my mind because I could swear I saw that same giant creepy mofo back in the center of the road again, way off in front of me. As I grew closer, I could see that if it wasn't the exact same guy, it was someone who looked just exactly like him. It was as tall as a basketball player, but as wide as a weightlifter. It was furry. It was brownish to grayish. It had clawed hands, and it had a head like some sort of prehistoric wolf. Its eyes brightly reflected my headlights, and it was standing astride the yellow line down the center of the highway, blocking both lanes of traffic. This time I did what I lacked the nerve to do last time, and that was I floored the gas pedal. By the time I was coming up on that monster man, I was going almost 90 miles an hour. I felt a bit of relief as he took a step or two to my left and gave me enough room to pass. But my relief didn't last for long because as I zipped past the dogman, he made this sort of lunge toward my car, and somehow he managed to grab onto something in the rear like my bumper, possibly. The next thing I knew, that creep was up on my trunk, acting like he was about to climb across the roof of my vehicle and get back in my face like the last guy had done. I was like, no thank you, and I slammed the brakes again. He bounced off my back windshield and then landed on his back on the highway behind me as I slammed down on the gas and sped away. If you're keeping score, it was now me 2 and Dogman 0. To say I freaked out would not begin to describe the situation. There was no way that Dogman could have gotten ahead of me in that short time period. It looked like the same creature, but how could it have been? You know, this may sound ridiculous, but I was actually reminded of that old Bugs Bunny cartoon in which a tortoise is continually and repeatedly able to get ahead of Bugs in a cross-country race. It drives the rabbit crazy. But in the end, we find out that the turtle was cheating and employing every other turtle he knew in order to win the race that way. I figured it had to be something like that going on. There had to be more than one of the dogmen, and they had to look the same as each other. And yet, if so, that implies that they must have been coordinating with each other. Somehow I had encountered not one, but 2 dogmen along the same stretch of road, both behaving the same way, both using the same bullying tactics, and both trying to cause violence and destruction. Honestly, it seemed a lot easier for me to believe that I had just lost my mind than that this was actually happening in real life. So, as I was further north, almost up around Nook, I swear to you, I wondered if I was dreaming a nightmare, because right there, up the road a ways, there he was again. This time I stopped the car and put it in reverse. I saw that dogman seeing me, and he started charging forward in my direction. I drove backwards on that highway at stupid speeds until I got back to the last road leading out of there. I think it was Patterson Road that I turned off onto, but I'm not sure. I remember that it wasn't fully paved, it was kind of a gravel road. I accelerated a bit, trying to leave this Twilight Zone insanity behind me before I really did lose my mind for sure. When I looked in the mirror, I saw that dogman cutting himself a shortcut and heading straight for the Patterson Road, or wherever I was driving there in the middle of the hectic night. There were twists and turns on this barely paved bumpy road, so I didn't want to open up as fast as I had on the highway. Couple that with the fact that I wasn't even sure if I might be driving the wrong way down this old country road, and that I might be rushing toward oncoming traffic, and a very bad ending. Each time I looked in my rear view mirror, that animal man seemed just a little bit closer. There was a cross street coming up at some point ahead of me, and it had a car zooming along it. Assuming I am correct that I was on Patterson, then this must have been Woodside Road. I turned to go in the same direction that the other car was heading, so hopefully at least I knew I was driving in the correct direction. You know, if that was a one-way street as I suspected it was. I kept a couple of car lengths back of this guy, trying not to crowd him, but also trying to keep myself close enough to him that the dogman would back off and leave me alone. I guess it worked, because I didn't see the bipedal beast behind me any longer after that. I kept on that road and took other alternate roads until I got back to where I was going safely with no more antagonistic dog-headed monsters trying to wreck my life and wreck my head. I really don't know if that was some kind of dogman tag team I drove through, or if that was really just one creature that somehow kept getting ahead of me on the road, but it sure felt like the latter. It was terrifying to be attacked in that way, but it was spooky on top of that because bam, there he was, that same dude all over again each time. It truly looked like it was him, the same him, over and over again. It did not look like these were different creatures. They were all the same height. They were all equally as muscular, and they all acted exactly the same as each other. How in the name of all that is holy could he have gotten ahead of me twice like that? There is no way that an animal, even the fastest animal in the world, could take a path through the woods and cut me off 2 times when I was driving on a fairly straight highway. It wasn't like I was driving in an arc to the right or to the left. I was driving north on a pretty straight line. He could not have taken a shortcut because in that area, the highway is itself the shortcut. You know, I lived through it, but even I am not sure what I lived through. I told most of my family what happened in a group email. I didn't want to put this out there on social media or anything because my business is suffering enough right now. I don't want my clients and associates to know that I'm talking about, stuff like this. Those are very serious people, and they would not find any of this amusing. They would just cut me off and use one of my competitors, period. So I ran the story past my relatives, asking them to keep it on the down low, but to tell me what they thought happened. Well, they all thought I'd lost my mind. They told me I was stressed out, and I needed to take a vacation, or even retire, and check into a mental health facility. 2 of them told me I was becoming a danger to myself and others, speeding backwards on highways late at night to escape imaginary monster men. Well, almost all of them acted like that in response to my story. Not my Uncle Johnny, though. He told me that he believed me. He even told me his own strange account of a similar situation that happened to him inside those same state game lands that I had been driving past. His story is a lot more violent than my story, so I don't know if you want it for your show. I can send it to you if you'd like, just let me know. In either case, that's the entirety of my crazy story of Dogman blocking the highway. Well, that story that the contributor's Uncle Johnny told him is in fact our secret uncensored story tonight for our PayPal subscribers and channel members to check out. Look in your email or on our community page to find the link to that. It's online now, if you are a member of either club. You know, none of this would be possible if it weren't for our executive producer for today, Julie Sadler. Some peeps are permanent, not some fadler. Of course, I'm talking about Julie Sadler. There are so few as cool as Julie, and that is why we thank her truly. Please join us in giving thanks to the great and wonderful Julie Sadler, without whom this episode would not even exist. In thanks, we share with her our secret uncensored stories, as well as our hours and hours of archive stories, which I am still making a new video chapter out of to debut soon. If you'd like to be as cool as Julie Sadler, just become a channel member, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Hey, it's me, Henry Lee Dogman, here to thank those of you who support all of us here at Scary Stories NYC. It really helps us if you click like, and if you forward our videos or leave cool comments. If you can, it helps us even more when you let us share our 25 episode and growing collection of uncensored Scary Dogman stories with you by becoming a paid subscriber at peterbernard.com. That's right. Join our monthly club and get 25 stories right off the bat, each of them wilder than what we're allowed to tell you on this channel. Then, each Sunday, get another new scary story, usually a Dogman story, but always uncensored and secret, available nowhere else on the planet. Please consider joining us today at peterbernard.com and keep the scary stories coming. Thanks, everyone. Dogman versus the Men in Black. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I think I know why Dogman only started to become famous in the 90s in most of the country. I think he was here all along, but I think the Men in Black kept it quiet. I'm basing my theory on this old story that my grandpa told me when I was a kid. This all happened way back like 1,000,000 years ago, maybe like the late 50s or early 60s, before I was even born. Back then, Grandpa and Grandma and my father, who was still young, lived in this little house in the woods that doesn't exist anymore. They lived near Thumb Lake up in Hudson Township, Michigan, which is south of the Gaylord State Forest area. In other words, no big surprise that people encountered a big hairy monster in that area, as it's wild and natural. Big surprise, however, seeing the Men in Black in that place. The little house my family lived in was located off of Thumb Lake Road, down a dirt path that was deliberately hidden by my family. Grandpa's father or uncle or somebody used to make moonshine back there in the old days, and that's why the only means of access was initially hidden. But my grandfather and my father were both still secretive kinds of people all their lives. I actually talked to a shrink about this. I want to be a more transparent person than they were, less secretive, because my wife is expecting our first child. I don't want to pass the secretiveness down to another generation. In fact, that's a big reason I'm telling you all this secret family story. At any rate, it was a dirt road off the main street that led to the house, but it was a gravel road in the area surrounding the house. When someone or something drove or walked onto the property, you could hear the gravel and know to look out front. If it was someone they didn't want to see for some reason, the family could run out the back, into the woods, where they had various hideouts prepared, stocked with food and drink. One night, Grandpa heard the sounds of someone out in front of the house on the gravel, and what he saw, he told me, changed his entire view of the world and put a fear in him so deep he felt it straight through to the day he told me this story. When Grandpa saw a predator coming too close to the house, such as a big cat or a bear, he had the habit of firing a shot over their head to chase them off. It almost always worked on the first try, but Grandpa told me that the thing he saw outside that night didn't look like your ordinary predator. This thing looked like a demonic, upright wolf, and he knew it was too intelligent to be scared off by anything he could do. Instead, he rushed his wife and his son into the basement, and the three of them stayed there until the sun came up, listening to the dogman moving around the house all night. The next day, Grandpa sent my grandmother and my father down to the Vanderbilt area to stay with some relatives. Neither Dad nor Grandma ever saw that upright wolf that night. That's why only Grandpa could tell me this story. The second night, Grandpa had invited a couple of close friends over, fellow hunters like himself. They were armed to the teeth and looking to take out the dogman if it decided to come back. Stationed on the floor in front of three open windows, the three men hid behind drapes inside their darkened room. They peeked outside, looking for the creature to return. The plan was to let that upright wolf get close enough that they could be sure to hit him with firepower. Grandpa was to give the signal, and they had planned to wait until they could see the whites of his fangs. Needless to say, the guys were all on edge, scared of waiting too long to fire, yet not wanting to react too soon and let the monster get away. One of them motioned to Grandpa, and he looked where the guy was pointing. It wasn't a dogman that he saw, though. According to Grandpa, there were two city slickers approaching the property through the woods. Two thin men in business suits with fedora hats, which were already a bit behind the times even back then. They were about to walk onto the gravel in front of the house, but Grandpa could already tell that they were very pale, very well-dressed men, wearing white shirts and ties and jackets and shiny black shoes. Where inside the forest were they walking from, he wondered. They looked so out of place, Grandpa said, that he found them almost as scary as the upright wolf. Plus, they confused him, and they made him drop his guard. Out of nowhere, from someplace to their left, the upright wolf man reached his hand right through the open window and almost grabbed Grandpa by the neck. He fell backward onto the floor, and the way he landed knocked the wind out of him. He told me that the arm reached around blindly inside the window past the drapes for another few seconds, as both of the other men moonwalked backward away from the window instead of taking their shot while they had the chance. Maybe they were too scared to shoot because of the unnatural look of the arm, which was neither a dog arm nor a human arm, but something in between. It had the musculature of a very strong man, but the long, sharp claws of a predatory animal. Or maybe they were too afraid to do anything but back away because of its unnatural arrival. They should have heard it approaching on the gravel, and they definitely should have heard the sound of it walking on the wooden boards of the front porch. Neither happened, though, and that thing was able to easily breach their perimeter. That's more than a little unnerving, even to hardened woodsmen like my Grandpa's friends. Within only a few seconds before Grandpa could even recover enough to get back on his feet, the arm was withdrawn from the window, and there was the sound of the creature walking off the wooden porch onto the gravel driveway where the road ended. Peeking out the windows, all three men watched an encounter unlike any they would ever see again. The two city slickers with their business suits and fancy shoes were walking calmly toward the upright wolf, who had adopted a violent-looking demeanor as though he were preparing to attack the two genteel-looking men. Grandpa thought they were both goners, and he considered going out there to help them. His friends shouted at him to stay inside. Maybe the monster belongs to them, one of the men suggested. They decided to wait and see what happened. If the creature started eating the men, Then they would be forced to attempt to rescue him, but not until then. As the three of them looked on, the city slickers opened their mouths in an O shape and stood staring at the monster. Grandpa couldn't hear them making any sound, but the beast was growling loudly, and maybe that covered up whatever the businessman may have been saying. The dogman, who was 1.5 times as tall as the city slickers, charged them, and the men got prepared to head outside and join the fray. Before they could, though, one of those city slickers waved his hand in front of his face as though he were swatting at a fly, and the dogman stopped approaching. He sort of skidded to a halt and just stood there bipedally, his back to Grandpa and his buddies. The two businessmen put one hand on either side of their faces and continued holding their mouths in an O position. It was around this point when Grandpa noticed how pale the two men were. It appeared they had shaved off their sideburns completely. Their faces looked almost like they were carved out of ivory soap. They were that pale, and that strange looking. The dogman began whining like a frightened pup, and it seemed uncertain as to what it should do next. One of Grandpa's friends said those men must be making noises that only a dog can hear. It seemed as good an explanation as any that Grandpa could come up with, so he thinks that was probably what was happening. All of a very quick sudden, the upright wolf monster dropped to all fours and raced away loudly to the left. Grandpa said he ran out onto the porch and watched him go, fast as a cat, back into the woods he must have come from in the first place. When Grandpa turned back to look at the two city slickers, meaning to ask them some questions, he didn't see them any longer. He wasn't sure where they could have gone since he never heard them walking away on the gravel. The entire experience was extremely unnerving, and Grandpa was pretty shaken up. When the three men returned inside, Grandpa's two buddies said their goodnights. They didn't want to admit it, but they were probably scared out of their minds. They had agreed to help their friend battle a wild kind of a dog. They had not signed on for being in some kind of science fiction horror picture. Grandpa offered them food and drink to try to get them to stay because he was not into the prospect of spending the night there alone. It was nothing doing, though. The two men had more than their nervous systems could handle, and they practically ran out the door to get back to their wives and families. After they were gone, Grandpa went around closing and locking windows. It may have been a hot night, but he was fully paranoid by this point and feeling extremely exposed. He finished locking the place up as much as he could and prepared to attempt to sleep with his firearm next to the bed. A loud rapping came at the front door, and Grandpa nearly fainted from shock. He hadn't heard anyone approach, so he knew it could not be good news waiting for him up there. Shaking all over, Grandpa made his way to the front window, peering out and seeing those two city slickers, the two very pale men with fedora hats and suits who had somehow gotten that wolf man to leave the premises. Grandpa had a few questions for them, and he wanted to talk to them, but at the same time, their seeming ability to appear and disappear made him very frightened of them. One of the men turned and looked through the window at Grandpa right in the eyes, which made him jump in fright. Then, Grandpa said he heard a voice in his head say he was being silly and that he should just open the door. I asked Grandpa if he was thinking that thought himself, or if it was mental telepathy or what, but he just said that something told him to open the door. And once he did that, the two men began talking to him in this odd, aggressive manner. One would say something, then the other would say something. The second one flashed a badge at him while the first one talked. Then they flipped the process. In this manner, his eyes were misdirected, and he never got a good look at either badge. He asked them to show their badges again, but they just kept talking over him in their weird, robotic, and yet musical way. Each of their sentences seemed like a non sequitur to the previous one. They told him who they were. They told him who he was. They told him the night was dark, and they told him it would be followed by a sunlit period. Different animals were active in the days than in the nights, yet he was active in both, as they were. It was like they were trying to introduce themselves, but they had only heard of the custom of introduction second or third hand. Then, the two strange men just sort of invited themselves in, pushing past Grandpa and seating themselves in a weird, dainty fashion on two chairs inside. I asked him what he meant by dainty, and he never really explained it very much more clearly than that. I don't know, he told me. They just didn't sit the way men used to sit back in those days. Grandpa sat in a third chair, and the men began telling him about what he already knew. They told him that he had seen a strange creature the night before, and that he had seen it again that night as well. The night before, there were different people in the house than there were the second time. They asked him why people kept moving in and out. The question at first confused Grandpa, and he found himself hyperventilating, unable to feel calm. Somehow their presence in his house made him afraid for his own life. They didn't seem to be armed, and he knew he was. So, why was he afraid of them? Their appearance was startling, for one thing. They both seemed to be wearing a lot of cosmetic makeup of one sort or another. If they looked that unearthly with makeup on, how horrible must they look without it? He stopped thinking of them as strange humans, and the terrifying idea settled in that these men were some other kind of being entirely. Answering their question, Grandpa explained that his friends were who was there earlier, and his family was who was present the night before. The two men looked at each other in this strange way that made Grandpa think they were talking to each other silently. At present, one of them asked if either couple of people were more valuable to him than the other. They seemed to know so much about the recent events of his life, but they didn't even understand the difference between his family and his friends. He told them family is always more important than friends, and then they began quizzing him as to what he would do if his family never returned to his house ever again. The question outraged my grandfather, and he wanted to tell the men how insulted he was, but he was so unhappy that he just could not find the words. Grandpa told me that he felt the strange feeling that he was going to pass away that night, and he wished he could see his wife and my father one last time. His mind flashed on the idea of running out that front door to his pickup truck and trying to drive down to see them in Vanderbilt. But he remembered how the bizarre men had just appeared at the front door. He shivered as he imagined driving along and seeing them alongside the road. Or what if they just appeared next to him in the passenger seat? The idea of that made Grandpa's heart beat too hard, and he began to feel dizzy and sick. He wasn't in shape to be driving, and any little shock out there might be the straw that broke the camel's back. Realizing he had to be brave and just endure this encounter, Grandpa began reciting the Lord's Prayer in his head because, well, that was the only prayer he could remember. The two men, or whatever they were, repeated their retelling of the events of the past 2 nights again and began telling the story a third time. When he finally lost his temper, Grandpa stood up and shouted at the men. He wanted to know what they wanted from him. Yes, he had seen the creature with the dog head on 2 successive nights. Yes, what they were saying was true. What was their point in repeating all this, he demanded to know. That seemed to be the reaction they wanted, because as soon as he agreed to the storyline they presented, they in turn stood up to respond to him. They seemed much taller and more imposing at that moment than they had been when they first came in. And now, everything they said contradicted everything they had said before. No, you did not see a dog-headed humanoid. No, you did not experience it reaching inside your house. No, You did not see the two of us arriving on your property." Grandpa was completely confused. First they told him what he saw. Then they told him he never saw it. Were they just trying to drive him crazy? "It is a lie that you saw a dog-headed humanoid. It is a lie. If you say you saw a dog-headed humanoid, you will be lying." Grandpa insisted that it was the truth, and the truth can never be a lie. "The first time you lie," one of the men told him, "your friends will cease to return to this house." Grandpa froze in fear like he was inside a big ice cube. Was he saying that he would make them hate or fear him and stay away? Or was he saying something far worse? Was this guy threatening the lives of his buddies? The other man continued to expand on this concept. "The second time you lie," he began. Grandpa did not want to hear him finish that sentence. "I won't tell people that I saw your pet or whatever that thing is," he screamed out, "but you better keep that thing off my property." The two men looked at each other in that strange way again. Grandpa was filled with fury at just having his family and friends threatened by these two freaks, and he pushed them hard toward the door. One of the men's hats fell off, and Grandpa could see his pale white head had no hair anywhere on it. It didn't look shaved. It just looked like the surface of an egg. "I won't repeat a word of this for the rest of my wife's life," he shouted, "as long as you keep your monster on a leash. But if I ever see that thing or either of you ever again, I swear to God I'll bring you in as a trophy and I'll mount your heads on my wall. Then I'll alert the press and I'll charge 10 cents admission for all the world to see the whole bunch of you weirdos." Well, at least that's the way Grandpa told the story. I wonder if he really was that brave in the moment, but he was still a fairly young man and he was a tough guy till the day he left us, so I guess maybe he actually got tough with the men in black. I wouldn't really know. I wasn't there. In either case, the dogman never returned, and my family lived in that house for another 4 or 5 years after that, I think. I've never heard of the men in black threatening people to shut up about Dogman, only about UFOs. Yet you rarely hear any of those stories any longer, almost as if all this material was top secret at one time, but then it was released to the public thereafter. That's where my idea comes from, that the reason we never or rarely heard of Dogman sightings throughout most of the 20th century. I think they were there all along, and people were seeing them just as much as they see them now. The thing is, they were threatened not to speak about it, and so they didn't. Does this mean Dogmen are somehow related to UFOs? And then that makes me wonder what UFOs actually are. Maybe they're not really from outer space. Maybe they're from wherever that Dogman thing came from. And if so, that might explain my grandpa's sighting of the Dogman versus the men in black. You know, my late friend Timothy Green Beckley once took a picture of a man in black who he said was haunting the lives of 2 UFO witnesses in Jersey City. Here's the photo. I guess you can decide for yourself. While you do that, I'd like to drop a rhyme for the man who made tonight's episode possible, our executive producer, Ron Barracuda. Ron Barracuda, more talented than Bob Zmuda. When the Dogman's on, that's where you'll find our Ron. Please join us in thanking Ron Barracuda for making this episode possible. Now here's PQ River to explain how you too can become a Scary Stories executive producer and access our secret uncensored episodes. PQ?
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club follow-up messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. You have a scary experience you want to tell us about? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.